welcome
Thanks
to
for having me.
Stanford
Thrilled to be here.
and to this little Power to Truth series that we started recording recently. Tell us some more about your work at the New York Times and sort of what kind of truths you brought to try to empower them.
Sure. Well, I joined the New York Times in 2006. And at first I was on I was a business school graduate from the Yale School of Management. And at first I was on the advertising and marketing beat covering advertising. But I had said to the business editor, I know something about finance and Wall Street. I've been to business school. I'd love to cover Wall Street. And he said, we don't need any more people in that group. But then in 2008, the day after Bear Stearns collapsed, he came over and said, think we could use another person on the financial beat.
It's really important, by the way, because I love when I find reporters who actually have an MBA, because wherever I go, it's like if they have some education, they know a bit of the stuff we teach here at the business school, that helps a lot for policymakers and for reporters. So it's great to find graduates of business schools in some of these areas.
Thank you. Yeah, it made a huge difference for me because here I was jumping into one of the most important stories in financial history, the 2008 financial crisis. But I had, no sources really on the beat because I was just starting. Bear Stearns had just collapsed. I hadn't built up trust with people or whatever. But I did know financial concepts from business school. So really having that education,
you know what to ask,
right, enabled me to jump in, ask tough questions, not be hoodwinked. And I actually ended up emerging as one of the more hard-hitting reporters, because in fact, since I didn't have those social ties or previous ties to sources, I just had
your knowledge from them.
I didn't get my knowledge from them. I just had my MBA studies and way of thinking. I went in, I asked tough questions, and actually managed to uncover a lot of things that were really important information about what had gone wrong.
So it's really amazing how that allows you to uncover truth when you know what questions to ask.
That's right.
When you know where to look.
That's right.
And so the education really matters, because a lot of the time, if an excess reporter will just become potentially a mouthpiece and so the truth becomes whatever the sources tell you.
That's
and
right.
Then you don't know quite where to dig and what to ask and how to frame for the readers. And so it's really important, but underappreciated in the media.
Oh, for sure. And one of my favorite MBA classes at Yale was an accounting class where there was someone from PwC who was in their forensic unit who came in and taught us how to find financial fraud.
Yes.
And learning about some of the biggest accounting frauds, and also thinking about what are the conditions under which someone can do fraud and how are they incentivized to do it, really helped me again. Not just
doing the forensic,
right? Doing the forensic and understanding the rationale, because the way fraud happens one time is never the same way the next time. But if you understand the incentive structure, the strategy, the way of thinking, then you can look to the new tactics.
Yeah. So I think that really well-informed, well-educated media that can sort of write well, explain well, ask the right questions is just so important. And then, it's kind of getting more difficult to find them. But when you have writers like yours, I quoted you multiple times in a book about the financial crisis because your stories were so cutting. It's in my slides right now as I discuss the next edition, because we went back to the same story to explain how the bailouts work.
Right.
Which you had a story explaining, and I say in the title it said quietly. This program helps quietly.
Right.
And then you exposed, for example, in another story about the small print in the way that the banks manage, money for pension funds.
Yes. I mean, that was the securities lending investigation. Exactly. I think you're talking about. That was an investigation I did. Because in general, after the financial crisis, one of the things that I and another reporter named Gretchen Morgensen, that we looked at a lot was how unequal the system was for ordinary people versus the big banks with the power. And why was it that people on Wall Street, many of them still got huge bonuses before and after the financial crisis, whereas ordinary people through their homes and their investments really lost out. And so we were doing story after story to examine the kind of tipped scale. And one that we did was on securities lending, which is where a big bank, they'll be holding investments for pension funds, for example, but they are allowed to, while they're holding their money, not just invest them, but actually loan out the shares of stock that they have invested those pension funds in. And the stock is loaned out often to hedge funds that are short selling things. Right. But sometimes the stock doesn't come out. I mean, it doesn't come back. Sometimes the stock does not come back. And guess who's on the hook? Do you think it's the bank or the regular guy, the pension fund? The pension fund, they lose the money. And so I did do this big piece, I think you're thinking of JP Morgan, in securities lending, and really showed how this New Orleans retirement pension fund lost all this money. And in the end of the story, you might remember the ending of the story, the quote, the person from the pension fund just said at the end, you know, essentially the leaders of this bank, JP Morgan, we're going to do whatever it took to make money.
Yeah, for their shareholders.
For their shareholders.
I was a shareholder, I would be happy. But as a customer on whose back this money was made, I'm less happy with that.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And then what about all the kleptocracy and the anonymous corporation? Talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So after all of this 2008 financial crisis, I should mention there also, I wrote a lot about Goldman Sachs in 2008 and also uncovered this big collateralized debt obligation deal they did called Abacus that led to a big settlement that they paid. And I mentioned that because Goldman Sachs is going to come up again in this kleptocracy case. Okay. So then a few years later,
with law.
That's right. A few years later, I got interested in, you know, where does corrupt, ill-gotten gains, stolen money around the world, where does it get hidden? And at first I thought I'd be doing a piece about, you know, the Virgin Islands or an offshore place. But I started calling around to basically investigators and asset forfeiture lawyers to say, well, where does the money go? How do you follow this money trail? And they said, you're in New York, right? I said, yeah. They said, just look out your window. It's right there. It's holding up your whole real estate market. And I said, but I thought it went through those offshore islands. And they said, it does go through there, but people ultimately want stolen money where they can spend it, and they don't live it there. So it goes through there and it ends up in US real estate. And so then, you know, I decided I should really try to find a microcosm and get into every high-end condo. Once we picked the Time Warner Center, which is an iconic complex in Manhattan, and got to the bottom of all 200 condo owners. And it turned out a couple dozen had been accused of major wrongdoing around the world, and in fact stolen the money. And there were multiple cases from Mexico and Russia, but probably the most notable one is in that building. I uncovered what became a $6 billion scandal where money was stolen from the people of Malaysia, laundered through those offshore places and put into US real estate. Yeah.
So that's what turns out to be the case, that the US and the UK are kind of the biggest destinations
they benefit
for dirty money, and they kind of, you know, wink wink and nod welcome it, because, you know, but then of course our housing prices go up, and, you know, London prices go up, and London starts being called London grad or whatever, right, all the oligarchs. And then, you know, that and art and other
they
places
also launder it through art, because Christie's and Sotheby's, you know, historically weren't always checking the same kind of detail on who was buying it. And really what our project revealed is that banks, for all the problems you have at banks, they did have more requirements to know their customers than real estate companies or than art companies. And so it was an unequal playing field where you could more easily put stolen money into real estate, or it's
and
still
possibly through some of the private equity or venture capital, or as well.
Yes, you could put it into an investment fund. There has been some reform since. This project I did ran in 2015, and there has been some reform. The Treasury has made some rules around real estate, and but you still could do it today. There are more hurdles, and certainly there's more awareness now. You know, when we did this project, It was before the Panama Papers and all of those projects that brought awareness to the
secrecy.
to secrecy in shell companies. So since the project, I think, it inspired many other outlets to write on this, and there is just more public awareness of this issue.
Yeah, I mean, there is a Corporate Transparency Act, but we'll see what happens with that. Beneficial owners, the US is a big laggard on these issues. So somehow it's very hard here to, as people say, you can't drive down the street without the authorities knowing who you are.
But you can buy something very secretly.
You can form a shell corporation without your name being attached to it. And we had here the founder of Global Witness, which did this big sting operation with law firms in New York, and saw how easy it is to launder money into the US, which they didn't believe was the case. And top law firms were agreeing to help their client launder the money.
It's really been a shift in the US in the past 30 years versus historical times, because actually originally in the US, it was kind of in the Jeffersonian focus on land ownership. Land ownership was supposed to be public because people were supposed to know, if you have an issue with a property, who do you talk to about it? And practically speaking now, it's actually very difficult if you have an issue to know who to even go to.
And it could be an anonymous corporation.
It could be an anonymous corporation. And I looked at the transactions of real estate held by LLCs going back over 30 years. And it just wasn't so common in the 1990s and before that, but it's really skyrocketed. And it doesn't mean everyone doing it is not necessarily doing illegal things.
Right.
But a little bit back to what I said on that accounting class, what is the environment for fraud? So everyone buying in an LLC is not necessarily doing something bad.
Right.
But they are all creating collectively an environment in which people who are trying to do something illicit can hide,
can blend in
yes,
with the crowd,
yes,
and become legitimate in the system.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's one thread. So how do we uncover things? You have to do investigations, and then who often knows things are people inside who would they talk to? Often to journalists, so-called whistleblowers. So what has been your experience with whistleblowers?
Well, so in every investigation that I've done, I've always had inside sources. You just cannot uncover the real details and prove them to a level that you could publish them without some people inside talking to you. And it's always very sensitive because people who have talked with me for these investigations, are putting their jobs at risk, even potentially opening themselves up to, legal action with their companies. Yeah. And usually what I find though is when it's something that's been done that's so wrong, people inside a place often really care about their institution. And they're upset this thing has happened. And so they want it to come to light. And so, when I have sought people out or been sought out by whistleblowers, it happens both ways. You really have to carefully work through the terms of confidentiality. Also, as a journalist, I try to think a lot about, again, if with the editors, if we've all decided we will grant anonymity, what are the steps we're taking so we don't inadvertently identify them? So you have to think through exactly how you describe them in the story, also how you talk about them when you talk to other people.
So do many of them have they tried to change from within, or what would have led them to speak to a journalist?
Sometimes people are raising concerns inside for sure. I would say that type of person who was raising the concerns inside and wasn't listened to would be the kind of person who would seek a journalist out.
Right. But because it doesn't work from inside.
Right. But many of the people who have been the best sources of information that I've found in investigations have not raised concerns inside, and they did not seek me out. But when I approached them, they thought about it, they realized it was a problem, and they wanted to be part of bringing it to light.
I see.
And for me as a journalist, I've worked with both people, but I actually do find some comfort when it's someone I've found myself.
Yeah.
And that, I know that they're not on an agenda for some other reason. So, both kinds.
They just reflect and come out with the actual fact. So they may have just not wanted to look into it before, or just didn't want to talk about it.
Or sometimes within a system. So for example, with the 2008 financial crisis, people sometimes in a system don't always reflect on
They're too busy.
the ethics of what they're doing, and if everyone around them is doing it, they're just participating. So I've actually found sometimes when I've interviewed people, the questions I've asked have caused them to even on the spot start reflecting and thinking differently.
I see. So they just never thought of it.
Yeah. And then they kind of, so that, I will say internationally, so I've investigated corruption in many countries, not only Malaysia, but articles that I've written have been involving public officials from Mexico, from Russia, from really all over the world. And in other places also, especially when you're investigating public officials, government officials, depending on the country, you have to be really concerned about people's safety.
Yeah.
And whether the people who speak with you are going to be arrested.
Yeah.
And so, for example, when I was in Malaysia in the summer of 2014, investigating the prime minister, so he ran the whole country, when I met the people who were giving me information that allowed me to establish that this money was stolen, in numerous instances, I met them, with my hair under a baseball cap, or it's a Muslim country there. I actually wore a head covering to some places because I really stood out there.
Yeah.
And, the first day I was there, I met someone in a Starbucks just looking like myself, and a photo of me with that person was emailed around to the point that I was with another source later who said, you need to be very careful for people's protection that people aren't seen sitting with you because government security is emailing this photo of you around meeting people. So then I realized the burden was on me not to stand out when I was meeting with people. So I really
started discussing you
a little bit just to,
but we are
not to them, they knew, the sources knew who I was,
understand.
but just so observers. Yeah.
So after the New York Times, you had a little stint in the Wall Street Journal.
I
and
did.
That was not quite as a reporter. So, but it sort of touches on a lot of things that are in the news right now, all the way to AI. So having to do with technology and with the business of the media. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Also at the New York Times, I was very involved in creating like the digital blueprint for the New York Times' transformation, which helped it get to good financial footing. Because of that, the Wall Street Journal recruited me to help them with their digital transformation. And at the Journal, I had this rare job because normally in the news business, it's very siloed, content here, technology, business. But I was the top editor at the Wall Street Journal running all the coverage strategies. So, which beats do we have and what are our big projects this year, but also the chief product and technology officer across the business. And one of the things that was already bubbling in 2018, when I first started there, I was there 3 years, was AI. So we actually did some early AI deployments at the Wall Street Journal, and I was able to bring them together by being, leading both the engineering teams and the news teams, and we were able to try some things out, and it's given me, a good perspective on AI and the news, which I now advise some media companies on strategy, so I often will help them think about their AI plans.
So what would an AI plan look like for in news media?
Well, news companies, like all companies, I think, are facing choices now about what they do around AI. And one of the biggest choices that news companies today are facing are whether they are going to do a deal and partner with a company like OpenAI, or whether they're going to.
The Wall Street Journal just.
The Wall Street Journal just had a huge deal in the last day. It just came out overnight. And so in that scenario, the Wall Street Journal had to evaluate, do we give access to all of our content to OpenAI so that they can train their models and take some money now, which will help our short-term profits? Or do we not do that? And what I advise news companies to do is, you don't have to do a deal with OpenAI, but if you say, no, we're not doing that, we're not going to be involved in the training, what I advise companies is, don't then say, and we're doing nothing on AI, because that's just not going to work. It's running through the whole economy.
The New York Times is suing.
Well, the New York Times is suing, but the New York Times also has made very large technology investments in-house, and they have not been public really fully from the New York Times all that they're doing on AI, but they've even hired more AI specialists. And so what it appears, because they are not doing the deal with OpenAI at this point, is that they are taking the other tact, which is, we will invent our own AI related products and we will integrate AI into our own business rather than relying on a place like OpenAI. So what I tell news companies is like, you got to do one or the other. And if you're going to go the path of, we're not going to do a deal, we're going to build our own, just be prepared to invest a lot of money.
Yeah.
But there are some news companies actually not doing either. Just saying, well, we'll see what happens here. And I think those companies are going to be quite behind in the product experiences they can offer to users, and it'll affect their future if they don't at least figure out what ways make sense for their business to use AI.
I want to go back to sort of truth.
Yeah.
So I do have concerns that, speaking of AI, the truth is more likely to come out. I tell you because I am in a space, and I've written in a space in which there's a lot of false and misleading claims being made. So if AI was to train on all the nonsense that has been written in banking, it would perpetuate them.
That's a good point. And I mean, from a kind of public information ecosystem standpoint, you could make the argument that
even racism, other things.
Right, that you hope all the news companies would be involved in the training because you want their good reporting integrated. But I think also these news companies have their own business decision on what they want to do. Misinformation, is a huge problem now.
Huge.
But I will say, it's complicated. It's not like all information that has been out there is not good information,
right.
That's
the thing is there's a lot of bad information. There's a lot of propaganda information.
For sure.
Obviously in totalitarian regimes where people, the top people want to control the truth, but in our free speech democracy, you have certain people wanting other people to know some things and not other things. So in the knowledge can get corrupted.
And in the case of businesses and companies, which is so much at the heart of what you do, well, a very big change with the introduction of the internet, which now it's been around a little while, but when you think with a longer horizon, it used to be if Goldman Sachs wanted to get its message out before the internet, they had to go through the news companies. Because that was the means of distribution. And with the internet, they can have all of their own messages out. In fact, a lot of companies like Goldman Sachs even have what they call their own newsroom. And so I wonder, it's very opaque what OpenAI and some of these different Anthropic are, what they're putting in their models, but are they putting essentially all press releases into it? And as you know, press releases are not always factual or truthful. So that is a risk if they're putting press releases in with the same weight as verified information.
Well, just news verification or fact verification is becoming an issue in our sort of post-truth
I
world.
agree with you. Yes.
Well, Louise, thank you so much for all your insights. Thank you for all your work. We're excited to hear about your books, 15 cents to the dollar, which took a lot of uncovering truth about wealth inequality and a relation with race. And it's great to talk to you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me.